The first sign of trouble wasn't the meteor itself. That had been the talk of every news station for days. Scientists called it a once-in-a-lifetime event, and people gathered on rooftops and in fields with their binoculars and homemade telescopes, waiting to watch it streak across the sky. It was supposed to be beautiful, something poetic, but it wasn't. The impact came in the middle of the night, a low, guttural rumble that rattled the windows and shook the ground beneath my feet. I remember waking up, heart pounding in my chest, thinking it was an earthquake. But the tremor passed quickly, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. I couldn't sleep after that. Something about the stillness was wrong, unnerving, like the earth itself was holding its breath. I didn't understand why until the next morning. By dawn, reports started pouring in. Small towns on the outskirts of the impact zone had gone dark. Communications severed, nothing coming in or out. That was when the panic started. But it wasn't until the first video leaked online that we saw what had happened. The footage was shaky, barely legible, but you could make out the shapes. Giant black bodies scurrying across the landscape like a nightmare come to life. Ants, but not the kind you'd crush under your boot or spray with insecticide. These things were bigger than a human, their mandibles clacking in the air as they tore through everything in their path. Homes, cars, people, nothing stood a chance. I watched the video over and over, my mind refusing to accept what I was seeing. It felt like something out of a horror movie. The way the ants moved, with such speed, such precision, like an army, their numbers endless. A swarm, a plague. Within hours, the swarm was everywhere. We didn't have time to pack or plan. The military trucks came through, loudspeakers blaring, ordering everyone to evacuate immediately. There was no choice but to leave everything behind. I grabbed my coat, my bag, and ran. The roads were chaos. People screamed, pushing past each other to get to safety. I saw the ants for the first time then, up close. They crawled over the horizon like a black tide, their bodies gleaming in the sunlight, too many legs to count. One of them leaped onto a car, its pincers snapping as it ripped the roof off like a can of sardines. The people inside, they didn't stand a chance. The screams echoed long after the bodies were gone. We barely made it to the bunker. The place was underground, deep beneath the surface, designed to withstand nuclear fallout. A fortress, they called it. But when those doors closed behind us, sealing us in with the sound of hydraulic locks clamping down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was a tomb. The bunker was cramped, stifling. Hundreds of survivors crammed into a space meant for half that number. The air felt thick with desperation and worse, fear. Not the kind of fear you could shake off with a stiff drink or a deep breath. No, this was primal. The kind that creeps up your spine and lingers at the base of your skull, whispering that there's no way out. I met the others quickly. We were all scared, pretending not to be. There was Davis, the military guy who barked orders like he'd been doing it his whole life, his eyes darting to the door every few seconds as if he expected the ants to burst through any moment. There was the doctor too. Quiet, methodical, always scribbling notes, muttering about radiation, mutations, something about the ants evolving too fast. No one knew how to stop them. The nights were the worst. In the darkness, the walls of the bunker felt too close, too thin. You could hear the muffled scurrying overhead, the ants' legs tapping against the surface like rain. They were out there, growing bolder, smarter. I could feel it. We all could. But the worst part came 3 days in. It was the morning after the first breach. The alarms had gone off in the middle of the night, sending us into a frenzy, scrambling for weapons, for anything. One of the air vents had been compromised. A single ant had gotten in. Just one. It took 6 of us to bring it down, and even then, it wasn't enough. It thrashed and screeched, its mandibles gnashing at the air, spraying us with some kind of thick black bile. We thought we'd killed it, but that night, Davis disappeared. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no sound. 1 minute he was there, barking orders, the next gone, like he'd been plucked out of thin air. I searched for hours, calling his name, pacing the halls until my throat was raw, but there was nothing. Just an empty bunk and that same eerie silence that had followed the meteor's crash. It was then that I realized we weren't just fighting the ants anymore. Something else was happening. Something worse. The ants, they were learning. By the time the second breach happened, we were on edge, a hair's breadth away from losing it. After Davis disappeared, the tension in the bunker thickened like a fog, seeping into everything. People stopped talking, stopped sleeping, like we were waiting for the next thing to go wrong. And it did. 2 nights after Davis vanished, we lost power. The hum of the generators, that constant low buzz that had been a comfort in the back of our minds, suddenly went silent. The lights blinked out, plunging us into total darkness. For a few seconds, all you could hear was the sound of breathing, panicked, shallow, like 100 people holding their breath at once. Then the scuttling started. At first, I thought it was in my head. That scratching sound, like nails on a chalkboard. But it wasn't. It was real. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, They all seemed to vibrate with the sound of those legs, tapping, scraping. They were close. Too close. Someone screamed. A raw, guttural sound that sent a shockwave through the room. People started scrambling, knocking into each other, trying to find flashlights, weapons, anything. And then the emergency lights kicked in. It wasn't much, just a faint red glow from the backup systems. But it was enough to see the thing in the corner. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The ant was massive, easily the size of a man, its black exoskeleton glistening in the dim light. It was crouched near the door, mandibles twitching as if it was testing the air, smelling us. For a second, I thought it hadn't noticed me. But then its head snapped in my direction, its multifaceted eyes locking onto mine. It charged. I dove to the side, just as it barreled into the spot where I had been standing. The force of it cracked the concrete floor, and I could hear the screech of metal as its pincers snapped shut. The others started firing, guns, makeshift weapons, anything they could find. But the bullets just bounced off its shell, pinging uselessly into the walls. And then it did something I wasn't expecting. It shrieked, a high-pitched, piercing wail that rattled my skull. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the sound kept drilling into my head. A noise so loud it felt like it was going to split me in two. But the worst part? The walls answered. From somewhere deep in the bunker, beyond the thick concrete walls, I heard it. A chorus of clicks and shrieks, growing louder. Closer. The ants. They were inside. That's when the panic really started. People pushed toward the exits, but it was chaos. The emergency doors were still sealed, locked down to keep us safe. Safe. What a joke. We were trapped, like rats in a cage, and the ants were coming. I could feel it in my bones. The ant in the room with us thrashed wildly, its legs scraping against the walls, crushing anyone who got too close. I saw a man try to run past it, but it caught him with one quick snap of its mandibles. There was a sickening crunch, and then he was gone, his body crumpling like paper. The air smelled like blood and bile. And then, just as quickly as it started, it was over. The ant stopped moving, its head twitching once before slumping to the side, dead. I didn't understand why. We hadn't killed it, not really. Its death felt wrong, sudden, like something had pulled the plug on it. But there wasn't time to think about it. We had to get out. I turned toward the door, my heart pounding, but then I heard it, the sound that stopped me cold. A voice. It wasn't a scream, or a shout, or the frantic yelling that had filled the room moments before. It was quiet, calm, almost familiar. "I'm here," it whispered, from somewhere deep in the shadows. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I knew that voice. It was Davis. But it wasn't possible. Davis was gone, vanished into thin air. And yet there it was again, that soft, eerie voice calling my name. "I'm here. Come find me." I turned slowly, squinting into the darkness, but I couldn't see him. I couldn't see anything beyond the dim glow of the emergency lights. And then the scuttling started again. It was quieter this time, almost imperceptible, like it was moving through the walls. But it wasn't just one. It was hundreds, maybe more, crawling, scratching, getting closer. The voice came again, louder this time, more urgent. "I'm here! You have to find me! Hurry!" I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. Something was wrong. This wasn't Davis. It couldn't be. And yet, the voice was so clear, so familiar. It sent a shiver down my spine, a cold, creeping terror that I couldn't shake. And then the lights flickered. For a split second, the room was bathed in darkness again. When the red glow returned, I saw them. Figures moving in the shadows. But they weren't ants. They were human, or at least they had been. The bodies moved with jerky, unnatural motions. Their skin pale and stretched tight over their bones. Their eyes were wide, unblinking, filled with the same insect-like glint as the ants. And then one of them spoke. "Help us!" The words were mangled, distorted, but I could hear it. A plea, a warning. I stepped back, my hands trembling. The figures moved closer, their limbs twitching, and that's when I saw it. Their skin. It was crawling, shifting. And then I understood. They weren't human anymore. The ants, they were inside them. And whatever they were now, they weren't here to help. The bunker was no longer a sanctuary. It was a death trap. And whatever was happening, whatever those things were, we were part of it now. The walls seemed to pulse, alive with the clicking, chittering sounds of the ants crawling inside the structure. My brain felt scrambled, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figures, the twisted, grotesque forms that had once been human, staggered toward us, their mouths moving like they were trying to speak. But the only sound that came out was a dry, rasping noise, like the last breath of someone on their deathbed. Their eyes. I couldn't stop staring at their eyes. Glossy, black, and soulless, like the ants. Like they weren't just inside them. They were them now. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced, desperate for a way out. The emergency doors were still locked, but there had to be another way. Somewhere. A hatch. A vent. Something. I could feel the others around me, their panic mirroring my own, but it felt like we were all paralyzed, like we were waiting for something worse to happen. And it did. The figures lunged. The first one grabbed the soldier to my left, its fingers curling around his throat with a strength no human should possess. He barely had time to scream before it ripped into him, blood spraying across the walls. The others followed, swarming us like ants on a carcass. They were fast, so fast, and the way they moved was all wrong. Jagged, like marionettes with their strings tangled. I turned and ran, my feet pounded against the cold concrete floor, the sounds of screams and gunfire behind me fading into a dull roar. It didn't matter. I knew it wouldn't save us. They weren't just killing, they were infecting. I reached the far end of the bunker, where a narrow hallway branched off into darkness. My hands fumbled for the flashlight in my bag, flicking it on just in time to see the blood-soaked floor beneath me, slick with gore. Bodies torn apart, limbs twisted at unnatural angles, and among them the ants, those enormous black forms, their mandibles still dripping with the remnants of what they'd devoured. One of them turned its head toward me. I froze. Its antennae twitched, sensing the air, its mandibles clicking together with a sound that made my skin crawl. It stared at me with those blank, faceted eyes, and for a moment I thought it was going to charge. But it didn't. It just watched. And then it backed away, scuttling into the shadows, disappearing into one of the vents along the wall. I couldn't explain it, but a sick realization settled in the pit of my stomach. The ants, no, the things they had become. They weren't just mindless killing machines. They were thinking. They were planning. I pushed forward, moving deeper into the hallway, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly in front of me. The further I went, the more the walls seemed to close in, the space growing tighter, more claustrophobic. The clicking noises above me never stopped, always there, like a countdown, waiting for the moment I'd make a wrong move. Then I saw it, a figure standing at the end of the hall, bathed in the flickering light from a broken fixture. I recognized him immediately. Davis. His face was gaunt, hollowed out, his skin pulled tight over his skull. But it was his eyes, those damn eyes, that told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't Davis anymore. Not really. You shouldn't have come, he rasped, his voice thick with something unnatural. It wasn't just him speaking, it was them, the ants, the hive, whatever they were. What do you want? I managed to choke out, my hands shaking as I kept the flashlight trained on him. There was no point in asking if he was okay. He wasn't. We don't want anything, he replied, his voice a sickly whisper, almost amused. We already have what we need. All of you. He took a step closer, his body moving with that same jerky, unnatural motion as the others. I could see the skin on his arms crawling, shifting, like something was underneath it, writhing. You're part of it now, he continued, his mouth curling into a smile that made my stomach turn. You'll join us, just like they did. You won't even feel it. It's better this way. There's no more fear, no more pain. I shook my head, stepping back instinctively, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be, but it was. Davis, or whatever was left of him, took another step forward, his fingers twitching at his sides, ready to grab me, to pull me into whatever nightmare he had become. But before he could, a sound tore through the air. A scream, high-pitched and animalistic, echoed down the hallway, making both of us freeze. It wasn't human. It couldn't have been. And then the walls, the floor, the ceiling, they all seemed to move. I looked up and that's when I saw them. The ants, hundreds of them. No, thousands crawling out of the vents, out of the cracks in the walls, their bodies swarming together like a living tide. They poured into the hallway, filling every inch of space, their mandibles clicking, their legs skittering across the metal and concrete with that sickening sound. They weren't coming for me, not yet. They were going for Davis. He didn't move. He just stood there, smiling, that twisted grin still plastered across his face as they descended on him. And then the screaming started. I turned away, bile rising in my throat as the sound of tearing flesh and snapping bones filled the air. It was over in seconds. When I looked back, there was nothing left of Davis, just a smear of blood on the floor and the ants, moving as one, crawling toward me. I ran. I didn't care where I was going. All I knew was that I had to get out. But as I sprinted down the narrow corridor, my flashlight flickering, I realized something terrifying. The ants weren't just evolving. They were recruiting. I ran, faster than I ever thought possible, my breath coming in ragged gasps as the sound of the swarm grew louder behind me. Every instinct screamed that I was already dead, that the bunker was a tomb and the ants were its gatekeepers. But something inside me, something primal, pushed me forward. I wasn't ready to give up. The corridor twisted and turned, and I barely had time to think, to plan. But my feet kept moving. The walls were closing in, the dim emergency lights casting long shadows that danced like specters on the edge of my vision. The air was thick with the scent of decay and blood, the stench of bodies, both human and ant, piling up behind me. And then suddenly, I saw it. A door. It was old, rusted, barely hanging on its hinges, but it was there, a way out. I didn't know where it led, but it didn't matter. It was a chance. My only chance. I threw myself against it, the metal creaking under my weight, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought it wouldn't budge. But then, with a groan, it gave way, swinging open into a small hidden room. The space was dark, musty, with old equipment and crates stacked haphazardly against the walls. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Perfect. I slammed the door shut behind me, my heart pounding in my ears. The ants would be on me any second, but I couldn't stop now. I scanned the room frantically, my flashlight flickering, searching for anything that could help. And then I saw it. A control panel covered in dust and grime, but intact. Above it, faded labels and warnings in military jargon I didn't understand. But one word stood out clear as day. Containment. My hands trembled as I wiped the dust away from the buttons and levers. The panel was old, ancient even, but still functional. I could hear the faint hum of power running through it. The dim lights on the console flickering in time with the heartbeat pounding in my chest. This was it. The bunker had been built to withstand nuclear fallout, but it had something else. Something designed for a different kind of disaster. Quarantine. A full lockdown. I didn't know if it would work. I didn't know if I even had time. The ants were outside. I could hear them, thousands of legs skittering across the floor, mandibles clacking, getting closer. Any second now, they'd find the door, break through, and I'd be dead. I could almost feel their pincers tearing into me, the black tide washing over, drowning me in a sea of horror. But I couldn't think about that. I had to act. I reached for the biggest lever on the panel, labeled Emergency Quarantine Activation, and pulled it with all the strength I had left. There was a moment of silence, a pause, as if the entire bunker held its breath. Then the sound hit me, a deep mechanical roar, like the grinding of metal against metal. The floor vibrated beneath my feet, the walls groaned, and I felt the shift, the slow, deliberate movement of something massive. Somewhere deep below the bunker, I heard doors slamming shut. Massive blast doors closing off the entrances, the exits, sealing the entire facility from the outside world. The ants shrieked. It was a sound I would never forget, high-pitched and furious, echoing through the walls as the bunker began to collapse in on itself, cutting off the swarm. I could hear them scrabbling at the walls, desperate, but they were too late. The quarantine was in place. The bunker was locking down. I had done it, but there was no time to celebrate. I could still hear them outside the door, scratching, clawing, their bodies slamming against the metal, trying to get in. The quarantine wouldn't last forever, and I wasn't out of danger yet. I needed to get out, find a way above ground, away from this nightmare. There in the corner, I saw a ladder, rusty but sturdy. It led to a hatch in the ceiling, barely visible in the darkness. Without thinking, I ran for it, my legs trembling with exhaustion, and began to climb. The ants screeched louder, the door behind me buckling under the weight of their bodies, but I kept climbing, hand over hand, the rungs biting into my palms. I could see the hatch above, so close, and with one last desperate push, I reached it. The hatch swung open easily, revealing the night sky above me. Fresh air hit my face for the first time in what felt like days, and I scrambled out onto the surface, collapsing onto the ground. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, staring up at the stars. But the nightmare wasn't over. In the distance, I could see the swarm, their massive black bodies still crawling across the landscape, their numbers endless. But something had changed. They were retreating. Slowly, methodically, they were pulling back, disappearing into the shadows. I didn't understand why until I saw the light. It started as a faint glow on the horizon, barely noticeable against the night sky. But it grew brighter, larger, until the entire landscape was bathed in an eerie orange light. And then I heard the sound. A helicopter. I scrambled to my feet, shielding my eyes against the light as the helicopter descended, its blades whipping the air into a frenzy. Soldiers poured out, their weapons trained on the horizon, and I saw the insignia on their uniforms. They weren't just any soldiers. They were the cleanup crew. They moved quickly, efficiently, setting up equipment, sensors, and strange devices I didn't recognize. They weren't here to fight the ants. They were here to finish what I'd started. One of the soldiers approached me, his face hidden behind a gas mask, but I could hear his voice clearly over the roar of the helicopter. "You did good," he said, his voice calm, steady. "The bunker's sealed. The ants are contained. We've got the area under control now." I couldn't believe it. After everything, after all the terror, the blood, the death, it was over. "Are they gone?" I asked, my voice hoarse, barely audible. The soldier nodded. "For now. We're not taking any chances, though." We're setting up a perimeter, making sure nothing gets in or out. I looked back at the bunker, the place where it had all started, the place where so many had died. It was just a dark hole in the ground now, silent, forgotten. But I was alive. I had survived. The ants were gone. The nightmare was over. For now.